Okay, everybody, welcome back once again. We're on to Unit 6, which is on policies, procedures, processes, mostly policies, and we'll define all those. But now that we've gone over quite a bit actually on physical security. We've talked about the physical barriers. We've talked about the lighting. We've talked about parking lot systems a little bit, locks, access control readers, alarms, cameras now. So we've gone over quite a bit of stuff, and I look back over the course of the term so far, and I think we've really covered a lot of stuff. It may not seem like it, but think about what you knew when you came in and what you know now about all of the things we talked about. And I can see by everybody's midterms and your drawings and stuff that everybody's picking up on it pretty well. So now we're going to top it off by talking about how you implement some of these things, and that's done normally through policy. So why does policy even matter, really? Right? We put up all this great stuff on the outside of our building, our barriers. We've got our locks in. We've got all of our access control stuff and our alarms and all the cameras and all the physical security equipment. But we have to make sure that people understand what it's for, what it's not for, and how they need to use it. One of the big parts is we need to ensure that employees understand their responsibilities. But we also have to understand our own, and policy does just that. It is a contract between management, security leadership in our case, and employees, and it really sets the rules about how we work and engage each other, what we expect from them, and what they can expect from us. Policy, procedure, process, the terms are used differently a little bit by almost every company and entity, government entity, and some use other terms. It could be a SOP, standard operating procedure, or standing operating process, depending where you are. Governments use directives a lot. I don't like that word, but their directives are more like policy or procedure. But for our discussion, policy is going to be the overarching explanation of what is required and expected, to whom the rules apply, and the basics of how the rules are used. So it really is a high-level document, right? It is not going to get into the nuts and bolts about every little piece of a task, but it is going to tell people basically what's expected by both sides and why we have it. Now, a procedure for our process, and we're not going to get too deep into procedures and processes, but for our class, it's a detailed way that the security department will implement the policy. So if our policy is on access badges, our policy might say that everyone needs to have an access badge, wear it as an ID, have to wear it while you're on the grounds. If you lose it, whether you'll be charged for a new one or where you go to get a new one, right? The basics. The procedure would be how the security department does it. When we issue a badge, we go and we take a new blank badge out of the box in sequential order so that it's easier to inventory them. We put this into the printer. We match that badge number and make sure it's the same on the record of the one we're going to make. A lot of different processes, procedures. Some of you have worked in the ID office at campus. You have a certain process and a procedure to go through. The process is really what the employees need to do. So, in order to get an ID badge, you will need to present identification. You will need to have your picture taken. You may need to provide your signature on the badge if you have that on your badges, right? You may need to read another policy on privacy and not lending your badge and those things, just so the employees know what they're supposed to do. So policy, overarching, kind of have the agreement between everybody, how we're going to handle this, what it's for, who it applies to. Procedure, exactly what the security department needs to do to make this happen. And the process is what the employees need to do to make it happen. That's the definitions we're going to use. Again, the terms policy, procedure, process are really different almost in every company. And so we're just going to go with our common definition so we know where we're coming from. So real quick, the difference between policies and laws. And some of you are Homeland Security majors where you may have administrative or even criminal law to consider as well. There's a difference between policies and laws, but it's really a kind of a vague difference. And laws are one form of public policy, really. Okay? They're criminal laws, civil laws and infractions, and administrative laws. If you're not familiar, criminal laws, everyone knows about the felonies, right? Murder, robbery, those types of things. Civil laws and infractions, think about traffic, right? Think about minor in possession of alcohol, something along that line, a civil law or infraction. Administrative laws are ones that administrative agencies put in effect and they don't need to go through the same legislative approval process. So the EPA can say that a car can only put out X amount of exhaust, right? X amount of carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide in the exhaust of a car. That environmental law is an administrative law. It didn't go, before Congress for them to determine how much exhaust a car can put out. Instead, Congress said, we task the EPA as an administrative agency under the president to carry the power, right? To make those basic rules. And so if you think about company policies, they're much like private administrative laws. You don't have to go before Congress to get them approved. You can't get them vetoed, although you can get them turned down by your management. But they're very much like an administrative law that applies to the company. Both policies and laws, company policies and public laws, can have punishment attached to them. We'll go over that a little bit, and I'll explain to you why it's not a good idea to have punishment attached to your security policies. But both of them need to be written and supported to be effective. You cannot have an administrative law that you make up on the fly, and you cannot do that with a security policy either. If you don't have a policy that says you can't park in handicapped parking areas, you're not on a public roadway. This sign was put up by you. It is not a law. It is a policy. And if you don't write it, then it didn't happen. So they need to be written, and then they need to be supported, not just by management, but also by the employees at large. So most, if not all of you, have worked a job somewhere along the line in your lives, and you know that companies have policies. There's one on pay. When are you going to get paid, and how much are you going to get paid? There are benefits, and not all companies have great benefits, but they all have some benefits. Safety policies and security policies, certainly, every company has some semblance of those things. There are policies on conduct, and that could be everything from what you wear to work to how you treat others. Scheduling, when do you have to come to work? What are the shifts like? How long are they? And then vacation policies, if you're fortunate to work for somebody that offers vacation. But those are common company policies, and security is a subset of those major components, if you will, of company policies, and there are more. But just understand that there are lots and lots of policies, because it comes into play later to make sure you have some agreement between them. So within those security policies, you might have a site access policy. It tells people that they must use their badge, if you have badge readers on your door, to access, and whether they can let other people in on their badge, when that may be allowed and when it's not. If you don't have a clear visitor set up, you may have people that badge people in. They're allowed to do that and then take them over to get visitor processed. You might have a parking policy, and you should have one. A duty to report, which is a really interesting thing, because it normally falls into HR policies in most places, but a duty to report basically says that if you see something, you have a responsibility as an employee. It's one of the contracts you have with the company is that you will say something. So if you see someone violating a rule, a policy, you have a duty to report that. Removal of property. Everybody wants to take home cardboard boxes from work when they're going to move because it's the easiest place to get them. But do you have perhaps some reason why they shouldn't take those things? A key control policy. Can you lend your keys to someone? When you leave the company, do you turn your keys in, or do you turn them to your manager? How often do you need to have them inventoried? Records management release. We talked last week about privacy and having a policy on when you can turn over things like access control and video files in line with the laws that we studied. It is important that you have one of those as a security manager. But there are many, many more, and many of them would be in line with what type of business you have, right? If you're in food service business, let's say you're in retail fast food restaurants, you may have a policy on whether or not things can be taken at the end of the day when they're no longer going to be sold and they're going to be thrown away. That might be a security policy. So there's many more, and they're really attached to the type of business. So when you sit down to write a policy, it should be consistent. Every policy should look a lot like every other policy, and they should have certain parts to them. And as simple as it sounds, you have to have a title. You have to have a revision date or a version. So when you write a policy, and you may change it, something may change where you need to change the policy, you need to have the date of the most recent revision on that policy on it. right? It's very important because otherwise people could be looking at an old version and make a mistake. You need a responsible department or person by title. You need the purpose of the policy, the scope, who does it involve and where does it involve, the content or body, which is really the policy, the meat of the policy itself, and often referred to as the policy within the policy, right? But it's the content. It's really what it's all about. Consequences of noncompliance, which really we're going to refer to them as actions, and you'll see why. And then ties with other policies, outcomes, and values, so that you don't trip up, have any policies that that contradict each other, and also add some strength to your policies if you can tie it in with other outcomes and values of the company. So every policy that you write, and the one that you will write for an assignment for me, is going to have all of these components in it. Okay, so let's look at each one of those sections. So the title, make it simple. Don't add fluff. If it's a parking policy, which is the one we're going to use for our example throughout the lecture, it's a parking policy. It's not a vehicle order, operation, storage while on company property. It is not a vehicle operation and correct placement policy. It is a parking policy. Call it what it is, because if you don't have a name that matches what you're doing, you run into trouble. So, for instance, if you have a visitor policy, it is a visitor policy. I had a visitor entry and processing policy once. And when a visitor was found wandering around aimlessly in a research division, I went back to the sponsor, the employee who brought that visitor in, because part of my visitor entry and processing was that you are responsible for your visitor, you must stay with them, and then when they leave, you must walk them out, take their badge, and hand it to security. And when I confronted the sponsor, the employee who brought that visitor in, they said, I didn't know there was a policy. I know there's an entry and processing, but that's entry and that's processing. That's how they get a badge. I didn't know there was anything about what I had to do. The visitor policy and the visitor entry and processing. Now, granted, they were using a cheap excuse, and they were a PhD. They should have known the difference, and they did. But they jammed me up because I tried to make my title a little too fancy. So just call it what it is. Always have the date and indicate what version of the policy is in effect. Okay, so if you write the policy today, it may be April 1st, 2020, revision 1. And if you go back and change the policy because something's changed and you need to change, whatever, you change the place where people come in because you opened another visitor lobby, then you go back in and it would be April 20th, 2020, revision 2. Always put the date and the revision number on every policy so that when someone comes and challenges you on that policy, you are able to tell them which one you are referencing, okay? Because policies will be in effect for many, many, many years, and they will change over many, many, many years. So always do that, right? Policies need to be reviewed annually or even more often, but at least annually you should go back and change that revision number and the date, or at least just the date, to show that it was reviewed so that your policies don't get stale. You may find that if you don't go back, it's a policy that's not commonly used, covers something that you didn't go make the change you should have, then when something happens, you weren't prepared. So always go back, have a revision date, have a date set in your calendar where you're going to revise policies in a particular week and do them all at once if that's what it takes. You have to list the responsible parties for keeping the policy up to date and for enforcing a policy. So this would be a security policy, and it would be enforced by the security leader or the security manager or the security team, however you want to put it. You would have an HR policy, and that's generally the enforcement would be HR, but it could be someone else, right? Use titles and departments, not people's names. Don't say the responsible party for this is Brian Wisniewski, because Brian may hit the lottery or get schmucked by a bus tomorrow. Either way, he's not coming to work, and you have to go change your policy. And if the policy's out of date, someone will skirt it. So always use title. The security manager and the security department are responsible for the maintenance and enforcement of this policy. So always use, don't use names, use departments, use titles. Purpose and scope. Next two sections. Purpose is really important because it tells people why you have a policy in the first place. using our example of a parking policy, it may be that many employees believe that companies have a parking policy just to mess with them, right? Why do we have to park in the north lot when it's closer to walk to the south lot? Well, maybe the south lot has some egress issues, right? Maybe there's a buried tank under there they may need access to, and so they don't want people parking in and overflowing that lot. The purpose is why you say the policy is necessary, and take your time so that you can make sure that you are justifying the need for the policy in the eyes of the employee. So for our parking policy, the purpose of this policy is to ensure adequate parking is available for employees, ensure the availability of reserved and handicapped parking spaces, and to ensure emergency access is maintained. So the average employee reads that and says, okay, well, you're going to try to make sure I've got someplace to park. So if somebody's taking up 2 spaces or parked crossways across 2-3 spaces, or has their boat with them and pulls it sideways and takes up 7 or 8 spaces, that's going to be a problem for me if I'm coming into work late and I can't find a parking space. We all have that problem on campus, right? Ensure the availability of reserved and handicapped parking spaces. Reserved spaces for executives, people roll their eyes, but it is what it is. But most people understand that if someone has a physical challenge, that parking spaces up close are there for their convenience for a reason, so that they can get into work as they need to. And then ensure emergency access is maintained. Nobody wants to be in a burning building and the fire department can't get there. So you stated why you have the policy, and you've made it very clear. And from that purpose statement, you can get support. People now say, okay, that makes sense. That's why we have a parking policy, so the fire engine can get here. The scope talks about who it applies to and if there are any exceptions. So in our case, the policy applies to all employees and their visitors. Exceptions may be made by security manager for special deliveries, special events, and during certain maintenance operations. So you're telling them that this does apply to you and your visitors. So now if you have a visitor, you have to make sure they park in the right place. That's, it's your responsibility. And that the security department may make some changes if it's necessary. So if you see a truck parked on the sidewalk, it may be there for maintenance reasons. Security's aware of it. So the content and body is really where the rubber hits the road on this thing, right? It's the meat of the policy. And often in the section, rather than say content body, which is really what it is, right? It's the content. It's the real, again, the meat of the thing. It just says policy. So you would have your title and your date and your revision and your purpose and your scope, and then it would say policy, right? The whole thing technically is the policy, but that's normally how they read. Okay, this is where you basically talk about what is allowed, what is disallowed, and what's expected. Okay, you're not going to get into a lot of detail here, but you're going to make it relatively clear, and the less detail sometimes the better if you make broad brush statements. So, in this, with our parking, right? All vehicles will be parked in marked parking spaces. You're not going to say that, you need to be within 6 inches of the line, you need to be able to make sure the other person can open their door, you can pull in or back in unless there's a reason for that, right? There could be. But you're just saying you have to be parked in a marked parking space. Make it simple, and it's easy to enforce. Signage for emergency zones and no parking areas must be obeyed. Easy stuff, right? Spaces reserved for executives for handicapped parking will require a visible hang tag issued by security or by the state. So if you don't have one of those things, you can't park there. It's very simple. Keep your statements really, really clear, to the point, and very direct, right? So that people understand what is allowed and what's not allowed. Don't get into a lot of detail here saying this is where you go get the permit. This is what color the permit must be. It must hang on the mirror. It can't set on the dash. Just put in there the basics. A process and a procedure later on, you can get into detail when you issue those hang tags about how you hang it, right? How you hang it from the mirror instead of just dropping it on the dash or on your seat or whatever, right? But in the policy, it's just a requirement. This is what's allowed and this is what's expected, right? And always talk about, and just, for parking policies, because we're talking about them, and they can be a real pain in the butt. When you become a security manager, you will understand how crazy a parking policy can be and how people try to skirt it. Always talk about oversized vehicles because people do tend to come in with boats and camping trailers on Friday afternoons to work in the summertime and they will pull them sideways across 8 or 9 spots rather than pulling them out on the roadway or in a corner of the lot if you can afford that kind of space, or simply not bring them to work. So always discuss that as well. So in your content body, keep it simple, keep it direct. Don't get into too much detail, but just say what is expected, what is allowed, and what is disallowed. Okay, now we're to the point where we're going to talk about non-compliance. So you have your policy written, and you need a section on what happens if you don't. If you don't comply with the policy, what happens? And you need to stick with actions for non-compliance. And the one thing that you need to always remember, security cannot terminate people. Other than people who report directly to you, and even then, you'd want to sign off from Human Resources and your legal department before you fire somebody. You'll get sued. You probably would win the lawsuit, but you don't want to spend half your day in a courtroom. Make sure that you don't have something in your policy that says if you violate the policy, you will be fired, because you can never enforce it. And once you can't enforce it once, it takes all of the wind out of the sail of your policy. A lot of policies in business today, and I've seen this in many, many businesses, will say that if you violate a policy, it will result in discipline up to and including termination. That up to and including termination is in a lot of policy, and it's as far as you really should go, because you're saying that termination is a potential, but I wouldn't even go there. It's kind of a slippery slope to somebody saying, I dare you. I mean, wait a minute, if I don't park my car right, you're going to fire me? And I'll tell you a story about just that, but you really don't want to throw that out there. It's not a discipline policy, it's an action one. In order to do that, you use a reasonable progressive action model. Okay? You've heard of progressive discipline before? When you were a kid and you talked back to mom or dad or whomever on the first time around, you probably got a stern look. You did it again, you got talked to, you did it a third time, you got sent to your room. Maybe that's the progressive discipline your parents used. I grew up in a different era. My dad was a union iron worker. We went right to capital punishment on talking back. But nonetheless, there's normally a progression to discipline, right? Instead of discipline, we're going to say we have a progressive action plan. So in this particular case, on our parking plan, right, we're using that as our example, but you can apply this to any policy. The first offense could be just a note to the employee. Hey, you parked your car in a handicap spot. We can't have you do that. Please make sure you park in an appropriate spot. Next week, they come in, do the same thing, because they're running late to work and it's close parking and they want to run in and get punched in so they can get paid. Next time, it's a note back to the employee saying, we did, sent you a note on last week and explained this to you, and you copy the supervisor so the supervisor can look at them and say, hey, straighten up, get here on time, park in the right place. The third offense could be immobilization of the vehicle, put a boot on it, right? And a meeting with the employee, the supervisor, HR, and security. That would be a reasonable next step. We've told you once, we've told you twice, the third time, we're going to lock the vehicle down so that you're not going anywhere, and then we're going to have this meeting, and then we'll unlock the vehicle, right? And you're going to have an inconvenience there. It's not punishment, but it's so you can't drive off without us having this meeting. And then on subsequent offenses, the vehicle is going to be towed at the employee's expense, and a referral to HR and the employee's management line is going to take place. So a note goes out, says, hey, guess what, Brian? Today your car was towed. It's available at Bill's Towing Service. There'll be charges for the towing and storage. Those are your responsibility. This is in regard to previous notes and meetings with HR and your management, and we've reached that point. At that point, in a parking policy, HR is usually going to step in and say, this is a job performance issue. They can't park their car right. They're just challenging us, and they will take the discipline from there, and it will become discipline at that point. But what you have is an action plan. These are the things I'm going to do in each and every case when these things happen, and everybody understands this is what I'm going to do. But you don't see in there anywhere that I'm going to fire you, I'm going to suspend you, I'm going to put you, you're not going to get a raise. None of those things outside your control can go in your policy because you can't control them. But each one of the things here, once my policy is approved, I can do. So make sure that your action plan is just that. It's the actions you're going to take to correct the problem and get to a result so that there's compliance with the policy. But don't indicate that you're going to have control that you don't have. Normally that comes across as you'll be fired. You just can't make it happen, so just skip that whole part of it. So I promised you a little story, and this is a good place to insert it. So parking policies. I don't want to spend the whole week talking about parking policies. I hope you understand you can apply this to any policy. But parking policy, I had a young lady who was a recent graduate, 4-year graduate with a degree in biology, came to work at a research building, medical research building, where I was the security manager. And one of the first things she did with her new job, because she had a well-paying job, she was in microbiology, I believe, and she bought a Jeep, a Jeep Wrangler, yellow one. It's a really pretty vehicle, actually. Not a big fan of Jeeps, but this was a pretty vehicle. And she brought it to work, and she didn't want anyone to put any scratches on it. So she pulled it up onto the grass medians at the research division rather than park in a parking space. Well, we really were meticulous about the grounds. It's just one of those things, one of those places where you had landscapers all over, right? A leaf fell off a tree, and they were running to pick it up 2 at a time. So we did the action model, right? Note to her saying, please don't park your vehicle there. Very next day, she parks her vehicle even farther up on a little hill on the grass. And she's tearing up the grass a little bit, right? So we did just this. Note to the employee and to her supervisor, please don't park there. The third time, we didn't have in our policy immobilization because at that time in that city, you couldn't immobilize a vehicle. You could tow it away, but you couldn't immobilize it, right? It was against the law. Only the police could do it. So our third offense was towing, and we hooked it up. So the third day in a row, she parked in the same spot. She'd been warned. She acknowledged she'd been warned. And she pulled up on a hill, and even farther up on the hill, the vehicle looked like it was trying to climb like in four-wheel drive up on a grassy hill. Really nice garden area. And so we brought in a tow truck and we towed it away. We sent her the note saying your vehicle's been towed to X towing company and you're responsible for the charges. And, we're going to have a meeting with HR and your manager set for next week. I got a call from the towing company, and we used them quite a bit, not so much for towing, but they also had the gas station where we refuel and get our security vehicles repaired there. They called and said, Brian, I got a bit of a kind of a weird one here. I said, what's that? Well, the young lady who you had us tow her Jeep just came down to pick it up. I said, okay, how much? I said, well, the towing was like $175. It's a very, high-end kind of thing, right? $175, and the storage was $50 for the one day. So it was $225. I said, ooh, that hurts. He said, yeah, but it kind of hurts you because she used her company credit card to pay for it. I don't know what she was thinking, but you can't use a company credit card and expense parking tickets on the outside. You certainly wouldn't do it if the company was the one who towed your vehicle away. But she did, and she ended up getting fired for expense fraud. So you can get fired for parking your car in the wrong place. I just thought it was kind of I don't know how you get a degree in microbiology, get a really good job right out of college. She was a University of Michigan grad, right out of college, really great job, paid very well with a major pharmaceutical company, and then explain to your next employer that you got fired because you couldn't park your Jeep right. I just don't know how you do that, but I didn't have to fire her. HR and the manager took care of that because of the expense fraud, but we followed the action plan, and it just so turned out, in my opinion, to our advantage. But there's your parking story. So most companies, entities, schools, nonprofits, they have published company values. That's something that's been done for 20, 30 years now. You establish company values. This is what's important to us. And if you can tie your policies to values or outcomes, something that the company has stated as a guiding principle, that gives your policy more weight. Okay? If you have a company value that says we respect each other, it's a common company value. Safety will not be compromised. Safety is job one, right? I mean, every company set of values has something about respect and it has something about safety. Safety is more of a cover yourself kind of thing in some cases, because I don't know whether they mean it or not, but I hope they do. Respect for each other, same thing. They want people to understand this is what we're all about. This is what our culture is all about. In your policy, you should have a section that is tie-ins to other policies and explain just that. This policy links to our values of respect for each other by making sure parking is available, and for our value of safety by ensuring clear and unimpeded emergency access to our workplace. Who can argue with that? Right? You took the job, and the company values are always a positive thing, and what you're saying is, I'm making sure you park in the right place because I want to do the right thing. Nobody can argue with that. So always do a tie-in to other values and policies. You also then want to mention any other policies that may impact it. So if there's a safety policy about parking near standpipes or fire hydrants, right? Keeping them clear more so than perhaps the local laws would make you do. You may have, here's a great example. Some places have their own water supply and they paint the fire hydrants different colors so that the fire department knows whether it's city water or on it's a pump dedicated to that building. And you may say that you don't want anybody parked within 50 feet of a yellow fire hydrant or in 100 feet of a blue one. That may be in the safety policy. And so make sure that if there's another policy that mentions the things that you're trying to do, if you have a visitor policy and there's you're in an environment where someone may need to check every visitor with the health, occupational health, to make sure that they don't have any allergies to anything you might be working with, that's part of the policy. Then you'd mention, also tied into, occupational health policy number, whatever. Make sure you mention any tie-ins, right? Tie-ins to values are a bit of a guilt trip because you're saying we're doing the right thing. This is why we're doing it. This is why it's important to you. But use it. Look, if that's what it takes, get people to just accept a policy and it's to do the right thing, then use it to your advantage and do that tie-in section so that people understand how it really, each policy has a purpose that ties into the company's overall purpose and values. So now you're going to write this policy. You know what sections you have to have, and you know what goes in each section, right? They don't have to be long and drawn out. Some policies are more complex than others and have more moving parts. But a simple policy can usually be done in 1.5 pages. You're going to be brief and you're going to be clear, okay? A standard format. Those items that I said goes in, right? The title, the date and revision, the purpose, the scope, the body, all those things, put them in every policy and keep it consistent. All of your policies should, if you squint, right, make your eyes a little blurry, look at them, they all should look about the same. They shouldn't be different formats for every policy. If you keep a standard format, it's easier to train people and it increases acceptance because it looks like a codified group of policies, something that is put together well, right? If you can get those into an employee handbook, that's a fantastic thing. If not, then you simply want to make sure that your HR department, who normally handles the employee handbook, has a mention that this site has security policies and they're available with the security department. Make sure they get mentioned to everybody that comes in their handbook. The big problem that every new security manager has, and every new graduate, and frankly, when I've taught this subject before, everybody that writes one has the wrong tone. They want to be directive. Employees will park blah, 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 blah. Employees will do this, they will do that, or they'll be fired, right? That directive. Don't make it a directive. It loses compliance. It doesn't gain compliance. When you become threatening in a policy, you just turn people off and they want to challenge you. Okay? Keep the tone positive. We're doing this because we have a purpose. We're doing it because it's important to us. Here's how it ties into our other policies. And here are the basic rules of what's allowed and what's not allowed. And here's the things that we have to do, unfortunately, if someone doesn't obey the policy because it's the right thing to do. Keep the positive spin in your policy. Keep that smile on your face while you're writing a policy, because the minute you start to make it into a directive where you become threatening, you lose compliance, you don't gain it. The other thing that's a don't is don't fail to review the policies of others. Okay, again, if the safety department or the HR department or occupational health department or anybody else has a policy that contradicts yours, you want to negotiate that before you issue the policy. Because someone will violate your policy, you will take an action, and you will find out that you have egg on your face because they will throw the other policy at you and say, but this policy says I can do that. This policy says I shouldn't do what you've told me to do. So it is your responsibility to check with others, and you'll find out that normally when it comes to security, you will find security policies that are contradictory to some safety policies, some occupational health, perhaps some engineering policies. You don't need to go and look at every department's policies. In a big company, there could be thousands, literally thousands of policies and procedures and processes. You don't want to be able to look at everyone, but know who the players are that you interact with a lot. Have them review your policy. That's one of the best ways to say, this is what I'm going to ask people to do. What do you think? First, they'll give you some good feedback, perhaps, because they're coworkers. Second off, they'll say, yeah, but my policy says this. You just said that. We need to figure this out. And you can come to that happy medium before you roll it out. So, be brief and clear in a standard format and get the policies out in front of people. Keep a happy tone to it and make sure you check with others to make sure that you're not in conflict with other existing policies. So how can these policies help you with your physical security? Well, first off, you have a workforce that can be a security force multiplier, because if you have policies and people understand what's expected, you can ask them if they see something to say something. And it's easier with policies. If people don't know what's really expected, they are reluctant to come and tell you about something, right? Somebody pulls the car up to the dock where you're not supposed to park, but you don't have a no parking sign, nor do you have a policy that says you shouldn't park private vehicles against the dock. Then employees may look at it and say, that doesn't look right, but I'm not going to say anything because there's no real rule against it that I'm aware of. And that car may be the one with the explosive in it. Plain and simple. So if you have a written policy, people are more likely to come to you. Okay? If you have policies on access, which you should, right? It's one of the standard security policies on access control. You can put in there that there's no sharing of badges or unauthorized access. You don't let other people in. Well, that certainly is going to help your physical security if you control activity, right? One of the other things is that regular offenders are regular offenders. And anybody who's taken criminology will understand what recidivism is, right? People who commit crimes are more likely to commit crimes again. Recidivism rate in the U.S. of felons, I think, is around 70%. I could be wrong on that, and I would appreciate if somebody gave me some up-to-date stats on it. I remember that's what it was several years ago. If someone violates your security policies, they are likely violating other policies the same way. If they can't park their car, if they're going to park on the grass, they're probably not following the processes and procedures in their laboratory, in their workplace, at their machine, or whatever they're supposed to be doing for the company. They're taking shortcuts there too. You can ferret out people through your policies and your policy enforcement, right? It's just not you that's being ignored. It never works that way. And good physical security requires an environment of order. Can you imagine trying to keep good physical security if you had a riot going outside of your facility every day in the parking lot? If you had protesters every day, you're trying to have good physical security when you've got to worry about things that are going on around you. If you can get order going, then you can concentrate on the other things that are most important to you when it comes to physical security, making sure that if you have order and people don't let others in, but then once in a blue moon someone does, you're going to catch that. But if it's happening every day, it's just going to happen every day. It's going to happen around you. You can't get control over it. So good physical security really requires that environment of order, and policies help you keep that order. So let's go to some takeaways. Policies are necessary, and they must always be written. You cannot have a security policy unless you write it out. When someone comes and takes something out of your facility, they grab something on the way out, and you don't have a policy on removal of equipment from the facility. Let's just say someone decides they're going to borrow a ladder, right? They're going to take it home. They're going to use it to paint their house over the weekend. And they take that ladder home and they get up on the very top rung and it breaks and they fall and now they can't work. They could potentially sue you. Whether they win or not is a different story. But they certainly aren't available to work, and that's what you hired them to do. So you should have a policy that says you don't take work tools home with you. But if you don't have that policy, what are you going to do with this guy when he takes the ladder out? And are you ever going to get it back? They have to be written down. So you need to have a full set of policies that cover you for any security contingency. Policies are a lot like administrative laws, but they only apply to your company. Security policies assign responsibility for both employees and the security department. So it's a contract between these entities. Your policy is saying, this is what I'm going to do, and this is what you need to do. It's a two-way street. It's not just directive. If you do this, then I will do that in a positive way, but it is a contract. Everyone understands what their responsibility is. Know the parts of the effective policy, use them all. I would even go so far as to say if there were no tie-ins to other policies, I'd still have that on my basic form for policy and say there are no tie-ins. I think you can always find some, quite frankly, as most companies' values are pretty clear, and you can always find some way to tie them in, but always use all of them so that you have a consistent policy. Spell out the progressive actions for noncompliance, not the punishments, not the consequences even. I used the word consequences early on. We've changed it to actions because that's what we want to do. We want to say, this is what we're going to do, right? No, we're not going to give any favors, nor are we going to be extremely hard on somebody. You know that if X happens, if you do X, we're going to do Y. Much like parenting, for those who have children, if there's any in the class, if you get grounded one time for doing something, and then you do the exact same thing, 2 years later, so it's not even a progressive thing, and you get grounded for a whole year, right? That's just a mixed message, right? You don't want to send a mixed message. So you have these actions that you will take, and you need to spell out your progressive actions so everyone understands what you are going to do if the policy is violated. If you can use existing values, company outcomes, policy, or not policies, but values as justifications for your policies, do that. Always good to say the reason we're doing this is because it's the right thing to do. Your purpose will tell you what the policy is intended to do, and your tie-ins will tell people this is really why we're doing it, because the company says we respect people, and this is a respectful policy. The company says we are going to be safety-driven, and this security policy helps everyone be safe. The company said we are going to be good stewards of money, and therefore this policy that says you don't take ladders home with you that you probably won't bring back is, you wouldn't throw the part about not bringing it back, right? When we be accusatory, but we don't allow things to go because we need to keep our work tools available to us so we can put out the best possible product at the best possible price. Always tie into those policies. Tone. Always keep a positive spin and happy tone in your policy writing and in your policy enforcement. It ain't personal. And you're not someone who's going to say, if you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm going to get you fired because, number one, you can't do it. Number two, it's just the wrong way to go about it. You won't get things done if people are challenging you simply because you're challenging them, right? It becomes that stare down. Keep a positive tone and a very consistent tone, okay, and get the compliance that you need. Make sure you check conflicts with other policies, right, especially with the common players that you interact with the most. You'll get good order out of your policies. The right set of policies will keep good order and discipline, if you will, around your facility. And then, if not, your employees will tell you when someone violates a written policy that they're aware of. If there's no written policy, if they're not aware of that policy, they're not going to say something even if they see it. But if they know it's written, they know it's a rule, they will say something, and that's where you get your force multiplication, with every employee really being part of your security program. All right, we've come to the end. There's no reading for this week. Okay, I think everybody's starting to get used to the online method for your other courses. I really have no idea what your workload has done, whether it's increased or decreased. And I hope it's stayed about the same. I know I've talked to several people in our department and other departments about what they're doing. Everybody's flying a little bit blind here, right? If you hadn't either taught an online class or if you converted one, you're not quite sure how it's, whether it's translating well. So everybody's kind of in that mode right now. We're being a little careful. And so I'm going to give you a little break. No reading this week. The lecture is done. This week in the discussion board, you're going to write a policy. I will give you some examples of the policies that you will write. And I want you to go ahead and just use those sections that we talked about in the lecture and write a policy. A page. That's all it really is going to take. Right? Don't make it too elaborate, and I will give you some, like I said, some topics of what policies you can write, and they may or may not be security policies. I want you to get in the habit of how you go about writing a policy and the different components, more so than the security part of it. Right? Post that in the discussion board this week. Next week, we're going to do responses. So we did plan on having our procedures reviewed by security professionals in the field. We obviously can't do that with the coronavirus pandemic now, These people are extremely busy, as I am as well. So I'm not going to send these out to other people. We'll figure a way to introduce you to people if you need to do that in order to start working on your networking. Not a problem. So this week I'm going to ask you to write the policy, and next week you'll do responses. You won't see anybody else's policy until you submit your own. So for those who wait until late and look at everybody else's work and say, okay, now I understand it, I want you to jump in there and do it, because you won't see anybody else's until you see your own. Okay? Excuse me. And then next week we'll do those, and then next week we're going to dedicate our lecture to the project. And I'm going to go over every expectation and what you'll need to turn in for the final project. Remember, your final exam, if you will, in this course is the project plus a paper, short paper, by the way. Those who have had me before know what my reflection papers are like. They're not a heavy lift, but I think they give you a chance to reflect on what we've learned and what you're going to take away from the course. And it also gives you an opportunity to tell me what we need to improve. Next week, you're going to get a memo from, this is a little heads up, you're going to get a memo from the project manager. Seems the decorating, furniture, landscaping budgets for our warehouse all went over estimates. We didn't expect to have to spend that much, but the budget is what it is, and there's an overall budget for building this building. And so they're coming back to certain departments and saying, well, security department, we gave you $55,000 for your equipment, but maybe you're going to have to spend a little less. So expect there to be an adjustment next week to your budget. If you already have a lot of expensive components, if you've picked out the high-end, heat-seeking cameras and a lot of lasers and a lot of retina scans and things like that, you already know you have to spend money on your head end and software and those things. You may already be right at your $55,000 number. Well, it's likely you're going to be asked to spend less and you're going to have to make adjustments. So watch for that memo. It may or may not be a drastic. We don't know yet, right? We're still waiting for all the numbers to come in. But when they do, you'll be asked for money. That's very common in doing security projects, so get used to it. We're doing a little realism here. That's what we're trying for, right? So with that, discussion board will explain what you need to do for your policy. You're just posting your discussion this week. There is no reading, the lecture. Next week, we're going to have a lecture dedicated to the project. It's a workshop type thing. So I'm going to go over everything that you will need to turn in and what it should look like. So you don't want to miss that, especially if you're a little confused on the project. You really want to take some time next week to review that lecture. With that, everybody have a good and safe week. Wash your hands. Don't go out. Behave so everybody else is safe and well. Talk to you later on in the week.